It started with a message, not an ordinary message, not a text that could be ignored or brushed off. This one carried weight, intention, and finality. By the time it reached Prince Harry, the words had already traveled through corridors of power, whispered in hallways of Buckingham Palace, and found their way into the hands of someone who could change the course of history. But nothing could have prepared him for what he read. Meghan, the woman he had stood beside through scrutiny, judgment, and relentless public attention, had just been stripped of her royal titles. Every privilege, every ceremonial honor, every ounce of recognition granted to her by the crown, gone. Vanished in a single stroke, like sand slipping through the cracks of a fragile hourglass. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Imagine waking up one morning, believing you have a place in the most powerful family in the world, only to have that world collapse with the blink of an eye. How would you react? What would you say? Prince Harry did what few could have anticipated. He went nuts. And it wasn't just anger. It was a storm of disbelief, betrayal, confusion, and raw emotion that no public figure has ever openly displayed. You might think you know the story, but what you're about to hear is unlike anything reported in the papers, leaked online, or broadcast on television. The first whispers came from palace insiders. The documents were simple enough, official memos, signed and sealed, detailing Meghan Markle's sudden removal from the list of royals entitled to certain honors and privileges. At first, Harry didn't believe it. Could William really have made such a cold, calculated move without consulting anyone, without even warning him? The thought alone was enough to ignite a fury that had been simmering for years, dating back to long-standing rivalries, subtle slights, and public missteps. But this wasn't just sibling tension. This was a declaration, a clear line in the sand. Meghan Markle, once celebrated, once embraced, was no longer welcome in the same way she had been. And the timing couldn't have been worse. It was a moment already charged with public scrutiny. Media outlets were already painting Harry as the angry younger brother and Meghan as the outsider who couldn't fit into tradition. The public had opinions, sharp ones, loud ones, viral ones, but nothing compared to the storm brewing behind palace walls. Sources described Harry pacing, making frantic phone calls, and even yelling at aides. He wasn't just reacting. He was calculating, scheming, planning. Every word, every expression, every moment was loaded with tension. You have to understand the gravity of this move. Stripping someone of royal titles is not just symbolic. It changes their legal rights, their financial responsibilities, and the way the world perceives them. Titles are the currency of respect in the monarchy, and privileges are the foundation of influence. Meghan losing these wasn't a minor administrative change. It was a seismic shift in power dynamics. And Harry's reaction? Explosive. What makes this story even more shocking is the secrecy surrounding it. Few knew the details before the first public leaks. The palace operates with a level of discretion and control that is almost unimaginable. Yet here, cracks appeared, and the fissures were wide enough for whispers to become news, and news to become a wildfire. Can you imagine the tension in the room when Harry first learned the truth? The aides who had delivered the message reportedly watched, frozen, as the man who had always been composed, thoughtful, and, at times, painfully diplomatic, suddenly snapped. Words were thrown around, some unrepeatable. Threats may have been implied. The air was thick with fear, uncertainty, and raw, unfiltered emotion. Meanwhile, Meghan was having her own private meltdown. The moment she realized what had happened, she reportedly went through stages of shock, disbelief, and fury. She had fought for her place, navigated the most intense media scrutiny, and endured public criticism, yet here she was, stripped of everything without warning. Sources say she even questioned her closest allies. Did they plan this? Was this my family turning against me? Can you even begin to feel that kind of betrayal? A partner you trust, a family you thought stood beside you, suddenly poised against you? It's a level of emotional turmoil few outside the palace could ever imagine. And the reactions didn't stop there. King Charles, ever the measured monarch, was reportedly taken aback by the fallout, though some sources suggest he had been aware of the tension brewing for months. Princess, and known for her blunt honesty, allegedly expressed her own incredulity. The palace aides? They were caught between duty, loyalty, and fear of making the wrong move. Every conversation, every whispered warning, and every internal memo contributed to a growing storm. Meanwhile, the media were circling like vultures. The first headlines didn't tell the full story, but they hinted at scandal. They speculated about rifts, tension, and impending drama. Social media, of course, had its own verdicts, viral threads, heated debates, and endless commentary. But none of it captured the intensity of what Harry and Meghan were experiencing behind closed doors. That was private, raw, and explosive. And as the world watched, completely unaware of the storm's depth, Harry began plotting his next moves. Insiders hint at late-night phone calls between Harry and trusted advisors, frantic discussions about strategy, and possible retaliatory actions. There were reports of him being spotted pacing palace corridors, slamming doors, and refusing to leave rooms for hours. This wasn't calculated calm. This wasn't a public statement released in measured tones. This was unfiltered, emotional, and personal. Every decision, every reaction carried weight, and every step taken would reverberate through the monarchy and media for months to come. But what was really going through Harry's mind? Was this about revenge, justice, or protection? Or was it pure rage, a reaction to what he perceived as betrayal against the woman he loved? We may never know all the nuances, but the clues are all around us. Leaks, statements, strategic pauses, and moments captured by those closest to the royal circle. Every detail matters. Every nuance is a thread in this unfolding drama. And here's the part most people miss. This isn't just a family dispute. This is a story that touches on public perception, political influence, and social power. Royal titles aren't just ceremonial. They dictate who has voice, who has access, and who can leverage their position. By stripping Meghan of her privileges, William and the palace effectively reshaped the landscape of influence within the family. And for Harry, this wasn't just personal. This was an affront to his sense of justice, his loyalty, and his vision of fairness. So what did he do next? Well, that's the question. Some reports suggest he considered legal action, while others hint at secret communications that could expose conversations never meant for public eyes. There are whispers of media strategy meetings, potential interviews, and even explosive revelations that might hit the headlines any day. Every move Harry makes now carries more weight than ever before, and the palace is bracing for the storm. You might be asking yourself, how will this end? Will Harry confront William publicly? Will Meghan respond with statements, legal filings, or strategic appearances? Or will the monarchy weather the storm quietly, hoping the scandal fades into history? The truth is, none of us knows yet. But the events that are about to unfold promise drama, betrayal, and moments that will leave the public and royal historians stunned. And just when you think the story can't get any more intense, there's one last piece of the puzzle. One late-night revelation that Harry reportedly discovered in the hours after Meghan's titles were stripped. One secret communication that may shift the balance of power and trigger responses no one expected. What was in that message? What did Harry read that night that caused him to explode with fury, pacing like a man possessed, calling advisors in panic, and making plans that might redefine the family's hierarchy forever? But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. This is where our story begins, right at the epicenter of a storm few could have anticipated, a tale of power, privilege, betrayal, and rage. From this moment forward, every word, every move, and every revelation will shape a narrative so explosive that even those closest to the palace might struggle to keep up. Have you ever felt the world shift beneath your feet in a single moment? That sinking realization that everything you believed was stable, sacred, and untouchable has just been ripped away. That was Prince Harry that night. Meghan's titles, privileges, and royal recognition gone. Just like that. And the person who delivered this seismic blow? His own brother, Prince William. It wasn't just the act itself, it was the deliberate, calculated timing. Insiders say William wanted to strike while public attention was high, while media speculation about Harry and Meghan's loyalty was already swirling. He wanted the statement to hit hard, to sting, to make a mark that would reverberate throughout the monarchy and across the globe. And for Harry, the emotional impact was immediate. Anger, shock, betrayal. Each emotion surged through him like a tidal wave, each one amplified by the sense that the very family he trusted was orchestrating this against the woman he loved. Harry reportedly paced for hours in the private corridors of his residence. Calls were made to close advisors. Words were thrown. Emotions boiled over. Can you imagine being in his shoes, knowing that your family, your brother no less, had just undermined your spouse in the harshest, most public way imaginable? How far would you go to fight back? But let's rewind a bit. This wasn't a sudden decision. According to palace insiders, the tension had been building for months, if not years. William had grown increasingly frustrated with Meghan's perceived disregard for royal protocol, her insistence on autonomy, and the public statements she had made that sometimes contradicted the carefully maintained image of the monarchy. Each misstep, real or imagined, was meticulously logged, dissected, and analyzed. And when combined with Harry's protective stance, the friction between the brothers reached a boiling point. The ultimatum itself was delivered through a mix of formal and informal channels. On paper, it was a memo outlining exactly what Meghan was losing: royal patronages, ceremonial privileges, and the social recognition that comes with titles. Informally, sources suggest it was accompanied by stern words, a warning that any resistance could escalate the situation further. For Harry, this was more than a bureaucratic blow. It was a personal affront. This wasn't just about protocol. It was about loyalty, trust, and family. The reaction from Harry was explosive. Reports describe him lashing out at aides, making calls to trusted confidants, and even speaking directly to William in what some insiders call a heated, unprecedented confrontation. Short sentences, clipped words, and raw emotion defined the night. But within that rage, there was strategy. Harry was not only angry, he was planning. Every outburst was calculated, every threat deliberate. And the palace? They had never seen anything like it. Meanwhile, Meghan's reaction was equally intense, though quieter. She reportedly spent hours in private, processing what had happened. Shock gave way to anger, and anger gave way to determination. How could they do this to her? Why would William wield such power without warning? And most importantly, what would Harry do next? The couple's private discussions were said to be a mix of strategy, emotional venting, and planning. The stakes were higher than ever. Here's where it gets even more intense. Sources indicate that William's team had anticipated some backlash, but they underestimated the ferocity of Harry's response. They expected statements, maybe some mild public rebuttals, but they did not foresee the storm brewing behind closed doors. Harry, fueled by a mix of protective love and righteous fury, began exploring options that were unthinkable in royal circles. Legal threats, potential leaks to media outlets, and carefully orchestrated public appearances were all reportedly considered. Can you imagine the tension in those planning sessions? The kind of emotional pressure that makes your pulse race and your thoughts spiral? Adding to the chaos, palace aides found themselves in impossible positions. Some were loyal to William, some to Harry, some to the institution itself. Each decision was fraught with risk. A single misstep, a single leaked document, could ignite a media firestorm. Staffers described tense meetings, hushed conversations, and whispered warnings. One aide allegedly said, "It felt like walking through a minefield in the dark. You never knew which step would blow everything apart." And then there's the public factor. By the time Harry realized the full scope of what had happened, media speculation was already heating up. Headlines hinted at rifts, social media exploded with opinion, and public discussion was reaching a fever pitch. But nothing in the coverage captured the raw, personal intensity of the moment inside the palace walls. This wasn't about optics. It was about family, loyalty, and a deep sense of betrayal. Sources suggest that in the days following the ultimatum, Harry moved quickly. Late-night calls, strategy meetings, and emergency sessions with advisors became routine. There are whispers of him considering measures that might not only protect Meghan, but also exact a form of personal justice. Some insiders hint at possible legal filings. Others suggest he was contemplating dramatic public disclosures. Every move he considered carried weight, and every decision would ripple across the monarchy. And what about William? While Harry's storm was growing, William reportedly remained calm, collected, and deliberate. From the outside, it appeared strategic. He understood the power of the move he had made and seemed willing to weather the initial fallout. But behind the scenes, William's team was preparing for counteractions, public messaging, and internal damage control. This was a chess game played on a scale few outsiders could comprehend, with emotions as volatile as the stakes were high. But here's the twist. The documents themselves were only part of the story. Palace insiders hint that hidden within the memo were subtle threats and veiled warnings, statements that could limit Harry and Meghan's options in ways the public would never see. It was a calculated move designed not just to strip privileges, but to establish control, shape narrative, and influence behavior. For Harry, recognizing these subtleties was both infuriating and galvanizing. As Harry digested the implications, the enormity of what had happened hit him. This wasn't just a fight over titles. It was a fight for autonomy, recognition, and family dignity. Every privilege stripped away represented more than just ceremonial loss. It symbolized the monarchy's attempt to dictate their lives. Harry realized that in order to protect Meghan, he might have to act decisively, in ways that could shock the royal establishment. Even in private, the conversations were tense. Friends and confidants reportedly warned him to tread carefully. The public would scrutinize every move. The media would sensationalize every action. And yet, Harry's determination only grew stronger. Could anyone truly blame him? Imagine seeing the woman you love publicly humiliated and knowing that your own family played a role in it. Wouldn't you feel compelled to fight back? The days that followed were a mix of emotional highs and lows. Harry alternated between strategic planning and moments of raw vulnerability. He confided in trusted aides, vented frustration in private conversations, and even considered moves that would have seemed unthinkable a week earlier. Every call, every message, every glance was weighed against the potential fallout. The tension was relentless. And while all this was unfolding, Meghan's presence loomed large. Reports indicate she was navigating her own storm, balancing public appearances, private strategy, and the crushing weight of being stripped of everything she had fought for. The couple's relationship, already under intense scrutiny, became a crucible for testing loyalty, resilience, and shared determination. The palace itself became a theater of tension. Staffers whispered about explosive arguments, secret strategy sessions, and late-night confrontations. Some aides reportedly feared making the wrong move, while others were caught in the crossfire of sibling rivalry and royal politics. It was a powder keg, with Harry at its center and Meghan beside him, both determined not to be silenced. And just when it seemed the storm couldn't grow more intense, there was a new development. A confidential communication, sent after the initial ultimatum, landed in Harry's hands. The contents? Enough to potentially shift the balance of power, expose hidden motives, and escalate the feud to a level that even palace insiders hadn't predicted. The exact details are still murky, but sources describe it as a message that could change everything. So here we are, at the precipice. Harry is furious, strategic, and ready to act. Meghan is determined, resilient, and seeking justice. The palace is tense, the media is hungry, and the public is watching. Every move now carries consequences, and the next action could redefine the monarchy's landscape. But what came next would push the feud beyond private conflict into a public spectacle that would shock the world, and no one could have predicted the scale of the fallout. Have you ever felt the floor give way beneath you, and suddenly nothing you built feels real anymore? That was Meghan Markle the moment she realized what had just happened. Titles gone, privileges stripped, recognition revoked. In an instant, the life she thought she had carved out, secure, powerful, respected, was slipping through her fingers. But it wasn't just a bureaucratic blow. This was deeply personal. And for Meghan, the sting was amplified by the knowledge that her husband, Harry, was already boiling with rage at the injustice. The initial shock left her almost paralyzed. Meghan reportedly spent the first hours after receiving the news pacing through her private quarters, a mixture of disbelief and anxiety gripping her. She called close friends, her voice barely a whisper at times, as if speaking too loudly would make the reality more real. "They can't do this to me," she said. "It's not fair. I've earned my place. I've endured enough." But fair or not, the decision had been made. And as the palace clock ticked on, Meghan felt the weight of a world closing in, one in which she had suddenly become the target of scrutiny, gossip, and judgment. This wasn't just about losing status. Sources indicate Meghan's social life, her charitable initiatives, her professional engagements, all aspects tied to her royal recognition, were immediately impacted. Patronages she had cultivated for years were suddenly in question. Invitations rescinded. Plans canceled. A subtle but powerful isolation was creeping in, leaving her vulnerable both emotionally and strategically. And yet, even as the walls seemed to close in, Meghan's mind was racing. She knew she couldn't simply collapse under the weight of this betrayal. She had survived relentless media attacks, public scrutiny, and private whispers questioning her motives and her loyalty. Each challenge had hardened her resolve, but this was different. This was her family turning against her, wielding the ultimate power, the ability to define her worth publicly and formally. While Meghan processed the magnitude of what had happened, Harry was doing the same, but in a different way. The couple's private conversations, according to insiders, were intense, emotional, and strategic. Harry, furious, was trying to contain his rage long enough to plan a calculated response. Meghan, equally emotional, was focused on understanding the implications, mapping out her next steps, and preparing herself mentally for a public narrative that was about to shift dramatically. Imagine, for a moment, being in her shoes. You have navigated public life at its most relentless, with cameras following your every move, every word analyzed and dissected. You've faced criticism, whispers of outsider status, and relentless comparisons to the rest of the royal family. And now, in a single moment, you are stripped of everything you thought guaranteed your place at the table. It's not just a loss of power, it's a profound attack on identity. According to sources, Meghan's private moments were fraught with fear and contemplation. Would she be able to maintain her public image in the face of this unprecedented humiliation? How would the media portray her now? Would her allies, both inside and outside the palace, stand by her, or would they distance themselves to avoid collateral damage? Every question added to the pressure, and every answer seemed uncertain. The psychological impact was significant. Insiders describe Meghan as oscillating between anger, sadness, and steely determination. She was furious that William had acted without warning, that her husband was dragged into this storm, and that the palace had orchestrated an action that seemed designed to destabilize her emotionally. Yet she also recognized that showing weakness would be seen as an admission of defeat. She needed to be strategic, calm, and calculated, even when her world felt like it was unraveling. There were also practical consequences. Meghan's financial arrangements, tied in part to her royal status, suddenly became complicated. Patronage payments, ceremonial stipends, and allowances were now in flux. Legal teams began scrutinizing every document, every contract, to understand what the ramifications might be. Every phone call, every meeting, became a delicate negotiation between emotion and strategy. Can you imagine trying to balance your fury with careful planning, all while the eyes of the world are watching? But Meghan wasn't alone. While Harry's fury was the visible storm, Meghan's determination was the quiet, relentless engine driving the response. She reportedly spent hours speaking with legal advisors, strategists, and close friends, exploring options to protect herself, safeguard her family, and challenge the decision. It wasn't just about titles. It was about dignity, agency, and survival in an environment designed to favor tradition over individual will. Yet, even amidst planning, the emotional weight was crushing. Those closest to Meghan report that she struggled with feelings of betrayal and isolation. She questioned who she could trust, wondered if her allies inside the palace had been complicit in the decision, and feared that every conversation might be monitored or leaked. The walls around her seemed to shrink as scrutiny intensified, and the sense of vulnerability grew. As the public began to catch wind of the events, Meghan found herself under a microscope like never before. Media outlets speculated endlessly. Was she plotting revenge? Would she leave Harry? Would this escalate into a full-blown family feud? Social media exploded with theories, memes, and commentary. Yet none of these captured the private reality. Meghan was fighting to maintain composure, assess her options, and prepare for what was shaping up to be the most intense chapter of her life. And while the public frenzy mounted, Meghan took steps to regain control. She began to coordinate with Harry, mapping out strategic appearances, statements, and communications that could push back against the narrative being constructed by the palace and the media. Every move had to be precise, every word calculated. Any misstep could have catastrophic consequences. In these days of uncertainty, Meghan also leaned on her closest friends and confidants, seeking advice, emotional support, and validation. She reportedly confided in aides who had remained loyal through years of palace turbulence, emphasizing that the fight wasn't just for titles. It was for respect, recognition, and the right to define her own role. These conversations, charged with emotion and determination, became the foundation of her next moves. But perhaps the most striking aspect of this period was Meghan's resilience. Despite the blow, despite the humiliation, she did not crumble. She didn't allow the removal of titles to define her worth. Instead, she used it as fuel, channeling anger into strategy, despair into action. In a way, this was the moment that would test her more than any media storm, public criticism, or rumor ever had. Yet the tension was far from over. Sources indicate that Meghan's growing plans, her discussions with Harry, and the coordinated strategies they were developing did not go unnoticed. William and his team were reportedly watching closely, trying to anticipate her next move, attempting to control the narrative and prevent any escalation. This created a silent war behind palace walls, a chess game where every piece moved carefully, every word mattered, and the consequences could ripple through the monarchy for years. And then came a revelation that would further complicate matters. A confidential document, obtained by Harry and shared with Meghan, contained hints of further restrictions, veiled threats, and possible limitations on their public actions. The implications were chilling. Not only had Meghan lost titles, but there were indications the palace intended to constrain their influence, manipulate public perception, and ensure that any retaliation would be limited or punished. This wasn't just about privilege. It was about control, power, and dominance. So here's the question for you. If everything you worked for, everything you believed in, was suddenly taken from you, how far would you go to reclaim it? How would you balance rage with strategy, emotion with intelligence, and justice with survival? Meghan was facing these questions every hour, every minute, every second. And the answers she was forming would not just determine her future. They would set the stage for a showdown that the world would watch unfold in real time. But what came next would push Meghan from private determination to public action, and it would be a moment that no one in the palace, or the world, would ever forget. Have you ever wondered what happens when a family secret explodes in front of the entire world? Not quietly, not behind closed doors, but in full view of billions of eyes watching, judging, and dissecting every word, every expression, every micro-reaction? That was the scene inside Buckingham Palace the moment word spread that Meghan Markle had been stripped of her royal titles and privileges. And the reaction? Explosive. It wasn't just Harry and Meghan who felt the tremors of this seismic event. King Charles, ever the stoic figurehead, reportedly felt a mixture of frustration, concern, and resignation. While he may have understood the reasoning behind William's decision, the fallout was immediate and uncontrollable. Reports describe him pacing in private chambers, reviewing memos, consulting advisors, and even sending discreet messages to other senior royals to assess damage control. Every second mattered. Every word mattered. The palace, once a fortress of tradition and composure, had become a pressure cooker, ready to burst. Princess Anne, known for her blunt honesty, reacted in ways that shocked even seasoned palace staff. Sources describe her as fuming and incredulous, questioning why such a dramatic action was taken without prior warning or consultation. Anne's reputation for being direct meant her private reactions carried weight. If she disagreed, that disagreement could ripple through advisors, staff, and even influence public perception if it were leaked. And indeed, whispers began circulating almost immediately, though no official statements were made. The tension inside Buckingham Palace was palpable. Meanwhile, aides and staffers were caught in a delicate balancing act. Some were loyal to William, others to Harry, and still others to the monarchy as an institution. The power dynamics had shifted overnight, leaving many uncertain about how to act, whom to trust, and what consequences might follow each decision. Some aides reported feeling physically ill, their hands shaking, as they walked the corridors where once everything seemed predictable. It was a psychological pressure unlike anything they had ever experienced. The decision to strip Meghan of her titles didn't exist in a vacuum. Palace insiders report that months of simmering tension, private arguments, and disagreements over protocol and media appearances had created a volatile environment. William, according to sources, had grown increasingly frustrated with Harry's public defense of Meghan, feeling it undermined the monarchy and the careful image he was trying to maintain. Every public statement, every interview, every social media post became fodder for internal critique, and this decision to act decisively was, in his view, a necessary intervention. But the consequences were unpredictable and explosive. As the news of the stripping reached the public, social media erupted. But even before the world reacted, the royal family itself was fracturing. Leaked memos hinted at a brewing rebellion among certain staff members who felt that Meghan's removal was both unfair and poorly executed. One source described the atmosphere as chaotic, with whispered accusations flying through the halls, and the tension so thick you could almost see it. Can you imagine the weight of that moment, standing inside the palace knowing that any misstep could ignite a scandal of historic proportions? The timing amplified the impact. Just days earlier, Harry had been spotted attending a private engagement, apparently calm, composed, and unaware that William's ultimatum was being finalized. By the time he received the news, the palace was already bracing for fallout. Reports indicate that Harry immediately called Meghan, his voice tense, barely containing anger, and together they began to assess the situation, strategize, and respond. But the palace wasn't waiting quietly for their reaction. Senior officials were already planning damage control, anticipating public scrutiny, and preparing internal memos to defend William's decision. And the media? It didn't take long for headlines to hit. Even as the palace attempted to control the narrative, tabloids ran stories of family feud, sibling rivalry, and a storm within the monarchy. Social media erupted, with millions weighing in on who was right, who was wrong, and whether Meghan's removal was justified. Every tweet, every post, every meme contributed to an atmosphere of frenzy. But the truth, as insiders say, was far more complex, layered, and emotionally charged than any headline could convey. Adding fuel to the fire were leaked emails, messages, and internal communications suggesting that William had anticipated some resistance from Harry but underestimated the intensity of his brother's reaction. Staffers described Harry as controlled fury incarnate, pacing for hours, speaking in clipped, precise sentences, yet radiating a raw energy that could not be contained. Every plan he considered, every option he discussed, had the potential to escalate the conflict into full-blown public scandal. Meanwhile, Meghan was navigating her own private storm. Sources say she was both grieving the loss of her privileges and preparing to assert herself in ways that would not be ignored. She reportedly spent late nights conferring with legal advisors, publicists, and trusted aides, mapping out how to respond, protect her image, and safeguard her family. Every decision was calculated, every step deliberate, and yet every moment carried the emotional weight of betrayal, fear, and frustration. But the emotional spikes didn't end there. Insiders recount tense moments between William and Charles, as the king tried to temper his son's decisiveness with caution. William, in turn, reportedly felt that the longer this tension simmered, the more damage it would do to the monarchy. The palace had never experienced a situation where personal feelings, public perception, and internal politics collided so explosively. And as the days passed, the situation only intensified. Rumors of potential leaks, both intentional and accidental, added another layer of tension. Staffers whispered that one misplaced email or careless comment could unravel months of planning, exposing internal conflicts, private opinions, and strategic miscalculations to a hungry public. The palace's usual machinery of discretion was faltering under the pressure, creating an environment where every action, no matter how small, could have monumental consequences. Harry, sensing the magnitude of the moment, reportedly began developing strategies to counter the palace narrative. Sources suggest he considered interviews, selective disclosures, and even private legal maneuvers to ensure that the public would understand the personal and emotional dimensions of Meghan's removal. But even as he plotted, the palace continued its own damage control, preparing statements, briefing aides, and monitoring media reactions in real time. The tension reached another peak when reports surfaced that Meghan's allies inside the palace were quietly rallying around her, offering support, advice, and protection. This, in turn, created a subtle but powerful divide among staff, with some accused of loyalty to William, others to Harry, and still others trying to maintain neutrality. Every hallway conversation, every private meeting, became a battlefield of influence, with the stakes higher than anyone could have anticipated. And then came the unexpected twist. A confidential communication leaked to Harry that revealed internal dissent among William's closest advisors. Some were reportedly questioning the wisdom of the decision, expressing concern about public perception and the potential backlash. The revelation was like adding gasoline to an already roaring fire. Harry, already furious and strategic, now had information that could change his next moves, and the palace was scrambling to anticipate the consequences. Can you imagine the tension in that room? The weight of knowing that your every move, your every word, could ripple across the monarchy, the media, and the world? The stakes were unprecedented, the emotions raw, and the pressure immense. Every day brought new challenges, new revelations, and new potential for escalation. And just when it seemed the situation had reached its peak, one final, shocking revelation emerged. A private conversation, leaked to Harry, that threatened to upend everything. It wasn't just about Meghan's titles anymore. It was about alliances, loyalties, and secrets that no one outside the palace could have anticipated. This was a turning point, one that would push the family feud into new, uncharted territory, setting the stage for conflicts and confrontations that would shock the world. But what came next would not just test Harry and Meghan. It would redefine the balance of power within the royal family, exposing cracks, secrets, and betrayals that had long been hidden behind the palace walls. And no one saw it coming. Have you ever seen someone reach the edge of control and then step over it completely? That was Prince Harry in the hours after he discovered the full scale of what had happened. Meghan's titles stripped, privileges revoked, and a family he had once trusted turning against them. It was too much. The simmering tension, built over years of sibling rivalry and media scrutiny, exploded into something far more intense than anyone in the palace had seen before. According to insiders, the first moments were almost cinematic in their intensity. Harry reportedly slammed doors, paced for hours, and spoke in clipped, precise sentences to aides, demanding explanations, recounting the decision, and questioning why the palace had acted without consulting him. Short, furious words punctuated longer, almost desperate statements of disbelief. "How could you do this?" he allegedly shouted during one private conversation. "Do you understand what this means for her? For us?" And yet, even in his fury, there was strategy. Harry didn't scream blindly. He processed the situation, calculating potential moves, outcomes, and public perception. Every word, every phone call, every private conversation was designed to gather information, test loyalties, and prepare a countermove. It was raw emotion fused with tactical precision, a storm that only someone who had lived under relentless scrutiny could manage. But what made this reaction extraordinary wasn't just the anger. It was the depth of betrayal Harry felt. William wasn't just a brother in conflict. He was a decision-maker wielding authority in a way that directly impacted the woman Harry loved. The move to strip Meghan of her privileges wasn't simply administrative. It was deeply personal. And for Harry, the thought that his own family could orchestrate such a blow without warning or dialogue was a betrayal of trust, one that ignited a rage he had rarely allowed himself to feel in public or private. Inside the palace, aides reportedly described a chaotic scene. Phones ringing constantly, secret messages exchanged between advisors, and a palpable tension that made every corridor feel like a pressure chamber. Staffers said Harry's energy was electric, uncontrollable, terrifying. But purposeful. He was not only reacting emotionally, but calculating the next steps, weighing every option from legal action to controlled media disclosures. Can you imagine the intensity of that environment? The weight of knowing that one wrong move could ignite a media firestorm or alienate allies. At the same time, Meghan was experiencing her own storm. Sources suggest she remained remarkably composed publicly, but privately, she was grappling with shock, hurt, and determination. Harry's explosion was mirrored by her internal struggle, grief over the loss of recognition, anger at the injustice, and a calculated resolve to fight back. The couple's private strategy sessions reportedly involved mapping out every possible response, anticipating palace moves, and preparing to assert themselves in ways that could not be ignored. Insiders describe late-night calls between Harry and trusted advisors where voices were tense, plans were debated, and strategies refined. Every idea was weighed against the potential for public exposure, media distortion, and internal palace pushback. One source said, "It was like watching a storm being directed. Every action had a purpose, but the fury behind it was undeniable." Harry's rage was not mindless. It was tactical, controlled chaos designed to prepare for the inevitable escalation. And escalation was inevitable. Reports indicate that the palace had underestimated Harry's emotional intensity, assuming he would respond with measured statements or minor resistance. Instead, he was mobilizing, ready to challenge the decision, protect Meghan, and, if necessary, confront the family publicly. His mind was racing, analyzing everything from potential legal avenues to media strategy, all while processing the raw emotional impact of betrayal. The emotional beats of this period were intense. Witnesses describe Harry's mood oscillating between controlled planning and bursts of explosive emotion. He would stop pacing, lock eyes with a confidant, and demand answers. Then, moments later, he would sit in silence, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. The juxtaposition of fury and reflection created a tension that those around him found almost impossible to endure. Adding fuel to the fire was the realization that the media would soon catch wind of the story. Social media chatter had already begun, and insiders knew that once the public was aware, the scrutiny would reach unprecedented levels. Every move Harry and Meghan made would be dissected, criticized, and broadcast. And for Harry, this added a layer of urgency. He had to act decisively, protect Meghan, and shape the narrative before it spiraled out of control. But the palace was not passive. William and his advisors were monitoring Harry's reactions, anticipating potential leaks, and preparing counterstatements. They knew the younger prince was capable of explosive responses, and the internal communications became almost frantic as staff attempted to predict his next moves. The tension inside Buckingham Palace reached a fever pitch, with every decision, conversation, and action carrying the potential for catastrophe. Amid this chaos, Harry reportedly made several moves that were both surprising and alarming to palace insiders. He contacted external legal advisors, discussed potential media disclosures, and began planning a series of actions designed to challenge the decision and assert Meghan's position. The energy was intense, deliberate, and, according to sources, unlike anything the palace had seen in decades. But it wasn't just strategy, it was personal. Harry's protective instincts over Meghan were intertwined with his anger at the perceived betrayal. Each plan, each call, each statement was fueled by both love and fury, creating a dynamic that was volatile, unpredictable, and powerful. He was prepared to challenge William directly, confront the palace publicly, and ensure that Meghan's rights and dignity were recognized. The emotional intensity extended beyond immediate family. Close friends and allies of Harry and Meghan were reportedly brought into emergency meetings, asked to advise, mediate, and prepare for rapid responses. These confidants described Harry as a hurricane of determination, balancing fury, strategy, and careful consideration in ways that few could comprehend. Every move, they said, had consequences that extended far beyond the palace walls. And then came a turning point. Sources indicate that Harry discovered a confidential communication, one that suggested the palace had not only stripped Meghan of her privileges, but also had intentions to limit their influence, manipulate public perception, and control their narrative moving forward. This revelation reportedly sent him into another surge of fury, one that combined anger, betrayal, and a strategic drive to counter the palace's plans. Can you imagine being in his shoes? The stakes were enormous. The monarchy itself, public perception, and personal loyalty were all intertwined in a web of tension, secrecy, and high emotion. Harry's reaction was no longer just about titles. It was about justice, fairness, and the protection of the woman he loved from an institution that he now felt was working against them. And just when it seemed the storm had reached its peak, there was another twist. A leaked conversation revealed internal divisions among William's closest advisors. Dissenting opinions, hesitation, and disagreements about how to handle Harry and Meghan's reactions. This information, now in Harry's hands, gave him leverage and insight that the palace hadn't anticipated. The chessboard had changed overnight, and the pieces were moving faster than anyone could predict. But what came next would shock the palace, the public, and even Harry himself. A move, a statement, or a disclosure so unexpected that it would escalate the feud beyond anything previously imagined, and set the stage for the next chapter of this royal drama. What would you do if the institution you trusted most suddenly turned against you? If the family you believed would protect you instead weaponized its power to undermine everything you had built? For Harry and Meghan, the answer became painfully clear. They would fight back. And they would do it using every tool at their disposal. The moment Meghan's titles and privileges were stripped, Harry's mind shifted into high gear. Anger was still there, raging beneath the surface, but it was now paired with strategy. Legal strategy. This was no longer just a private matter. The stakes had escalated to a point where every word, every document, and every conversation could have massive consequences. Not just for Meghan's public image, but for the couple's autonomy, security, and future. Sources report that within hours of the palace decree, Harry had contacted a team of top-tier lawyers, ones known for handling high-profile, high-stakes cases. He wanted to explore every possible avenue. The legality of stripping Meghan's privileges, potential violations of internal agreements, and the rights they still retained under both UK law and royal protocols. It wasn't just about revenge. It was about protection, ensuring that no decision could be enforced in a way that left Meghan powerless. But navigating royal law isn't simple. The monarchy operates on centuries of tradition, unwritten rules, and complex precedents. Sources indicate that Harry's legal team had to pore over decades of royal decrees, memos, and historical rulings to determine what could be challenged and what would inevitably remain untouchable. Every clause mattered. Every historical precedent became a weapon in a battle most of the public couldn't even begin to understand. And then there was the emotional dimension. Legal action isn't just about documents and statutes. It's about perception, strategy, and timing. Harry reportedly wrestled with these elements late into the night. Should they file quietly, behind closed doors, and risk the palace controlling the narrative? Or should they move publicly, creating a spectacle that could sway public opinion, put pressure on William and the palace, and force concessions? Each option carried risks, and insiders describe Harry as weighing them meticulously, balancing fury, love, and tactical thinking. Meanwhile, Meghan was actively involved in the planning. Sources say she spent hours in private meetings with legal advisors, asking precise, pointed questions about every potential outcome. She wasn't content to sit back and let the palace dictate the story. She wanted to understand her rights, the limitations of the decree, and the ways she could assert herself legally and publicly. Her determination, paired with Harry's anger, created a synergy that palace insiders reportedly found both shocking and alarming. The legal groundwork was just the beginning. Harry and Meghan also explored avenues to protect their public image and preempt media narratives. Advisors suggested controlled disclosures, timed statements, and carefully orchestrated appearances. Every move was designed to send a clear message. This wasn't a passive reaction. It was a calculated strategy that blended legal action, public communication, and private negotiation. Sources describe a series of meetings between Harry, Meghan, and their legal team that lasted late into the night. Every memo was scrutinized, every document double-checked, and every potential palace response anticipated. One insider said, "It was like watching a general plan a campaign. They were preparing for a battle that had already begun, even if no one outside the palace knew it yet." And then came the first shocking revelation. Internal palace communications suggested that William and his advisors anticipated some legal resistance, but they underestimated Harry's intensity. They assumed that legal filings, if any, would be procedural, calm, and unlikely to create a public spectacle. Instead, Harry was preparing moves designed to maximize both legal leverage and public impact. He was no longer just reacting. He was proactively shaping the battlefield. The emotional stakes were enormous. Legal battles within the monarchy aren't just about law. They're about reputation, influence, and control. Harry knew that every filing, every threat, and every court document would be scrutinized, leaked, and analyzed. The pressure was relentless. The weight of public opinion, family loyalty, and historical precedent all pressed down on him. And yet, he pushed forward, fueled by a combination of rage, love, and determination. Meanwhile, Meghan was coordinating with allies outside the palace. Friends, trusted aides, and advisors were engaged to monitor media narratives, anticipate palace messaging, and prepare counterstatements. Sources indicate that Meghan's strategic thinking was relentless. She wanted not only to protect her position, but to ensure that the world understood the injustice of what had been done to her. The stakes weren't just personal, they were political, public, and highly visible. One of the most dramatic elements, insiders report, involved secret communications between Harry and high-level advisors within the monarchy. Some attempted to mediate, others warned of potential fallout, but all recognized the unprecedented nature of the situation. Never before had a royal family member responded to a punitive action with such coordinated legal and public strategy. The implications were enormous, not just for Meghan and Harry, but for the institution itself. And as the couple prepared for potential legal action, new information surfaced. Leaks indicated that the palace had been internally divided over the stripping of Meghan's privileges. Some advisors reportedly opposed it, fearing public backlash and media scrutiny. Others supported it fully, emphasizing control, protocol, and tradition. This internal division provided Harry and Meghan with insight, potential leverage, and a roadmap for where the palace might be vulnerable. Even as the legal planning intensified, the emotional landscape remained volatile. Harry's anger, Meghan's frustration, and both of their fears of public misrepresentation created moments of tension, exhaustion, and urgency. But these emotions were tempered by calculation. Every decision was analyzed, debated, and prepared to be executed with precision. The combination of raw emotion and strategic thinking made the couple's response both unpredictable and formidable. And then there was the media. The public's appetite for royal drama had never been greater, and insiders knew that any legal maneuver could become a headline, a tweet, or a viral story within hours. Harry reportedly instructed advisors to prepare messaging that could be deployed if necessary, ensuring that public perception would be influenced alongside legal actions. He understood that law alone would not protect Meghan. Perception was just as critical as precedent. But the palace wasn't waiting quietly. William and his team reportedly monitored every potential move, analyzing statements, media leaks, and internal communications for signs of strategy. Advisors warned of potential escalation, conflicts, and public exposure. And as the pressure mounted, Harry made a series of decisive moves, filing inquiries, seeking clarifications, and preparing legal filings that insiders describe as bold, unprecedented, and deeply strategic. Yet even with legal and strategic measures in place, the couple faced uncertainty. The palace had centuries of institutional knowledge, leverage, and influence. Harry and Meghan were pushing boundaries, testing traditions, and challenging an institution that thrives on stability, discretion, and control. Every decision carried enormous risk, every action was scrutinized, and the outcome remained uncertain. And then came the first major turning point. A confidential response from the palace hinted at possible negotiations, but it was couched in language so veiled, so calculated, that it only fueled Harry's resolve. Insiders say he recognized the tactic immediately. The palace was testing him, probing for weaknesses, and attempting to control the narrative before it could fully erupt. This realization reportedly hardened his resolve, solidifying plans for both legal action and public strategy. So here's the question for you. If the very institution designed to protect your spouse instead worked against them, How far would you go to push back? Harry had reached a point where emotion, strategy, and urgency intersected. Every move, every word, and every disclosure had the potential to escalate the conflict, and he was ready to do whatever it took. But what came next would turn the private legal maneuvering into a full-blown public spectacle, a confrontation that no one in the palace, or the world, was prepared for. Have you ever witnessed a private family feud explode into a global spectacle? That was the reality for Harry and Meghan as the palace's decision to strip Meghan of her titles hit the media. The story didn't just leak, it detonated. Within hours, headlines across the globe screamed about sibling rivalry, betrayal, and a monarchy in crisis. Social media erupted. Hashtags trended. Memes circulated. And the public was insatiable, dissecting every photo, every word, every glance. The first reports were careful, almost polite. Royal titles stripped. Meghan Markle faces unprecedented change, they said. But within hours, tabloids and online outlets turned the narrative into drama, speculation, and sensationalism. Every publication had an angle. Some framed Meghan as the victim, unfairly targeted by a system steeped in tradition. Others portrayed her as an outsider whose defiance had finally provoked the consequences. The media frenzy didn't just comment on the event. It shaped it, fueled it, and amplified it beyond control. Inside the palace, the atmosphere was electric. Staffers described corridors buzzing with tension as aides scrambled to anticipate media reaction. Press offices worked around the clock, drafting statements, preparing spokespeople, and trying to manage the narrative, but the public's appetite was already voracious. Social media users dissected every minor detail, speculating about the motives behind William's decision, Harry's fury, and Meghan's next moves. It wasn't just coverage, it was a global debate, uncontrolled, chaotic, and relentless. Harry and Meghan's team, aware of the storm, began monitoring every outlet, tweet, and post. They needed to understand the narrative as it unfolded, to anticipate misinterpretations, and to prepare responses. Sources indicate that Harry was particularly focused on protecting Meghan from misrepresentation. Every headline that framed her unfairly became a strategic consideration. Every viral meme that mocked or mischaracterized her fueled his determination. But the media frenzy was more than just words on a page. It had a psychological impact. Sources say Meghan struggled with the intense scrutiny. Every appearance, every gesture, every interaction was analyzed. Rumors flew, some absurd, some plausible, all damaging. For someone already reeling from the loss of titles and privileges, this unrelenting spotlight created immense pressure. And Harry, already furious, was compelled to act, not just to protect Meghan legally, but to manage the storm of public opinion that threatened to define her in ways the couple could not allow. Adding to the chaos were conflicting narratives. Some outlets reported that Meghan had been isolated, shunned by the family. Others suggested she had been plotting revenge, colluding with Harry to publicly undermine William. Contradictions appeared, sources misquoted, and the line between fact and fiction blurred. For Harry and Meghan, the challenge was not only to protect their rights, but also to reclaim their story, to assert control over how the world perceived them. The couple's advisors worked tirelessly. Social media teams monitored trends and viral posts. Legal teams scrutinized every public claim for inaccuracies, preparing to respond where necessary. Harry, deeply involved, reportedly guided decisions on messaging, timing, and emphasis, balancing anger with diplomacy. He understood that one poorly framed response could escalate matters further, and yet inaction was equally dangerous. The emotional stakes were profound. Harry's fury at the palace's decision collided with the frustration of seeing Meghan misrepresented at every turn. According to insiders, he oscillated between controlled planning and raw emotional bursts, pacing the residence, phone calls flying to confidants, private meetings stretching into the night. The combination of legal strategy, media management, and personal rage created a pressure cooker situation that no one outside the palace could fully comprehend. And the public's reaction intensified the pressure. Polls began appearing within days, assessing opinions about Meghan, Harry, and William's actions. Social media platforms became battlegrounds. Comment sections exploded with anger, sympathy, outrage, and debate. Each viral post, whether supportive or critical, fed into a cycle that the palace could neither control nor predict. Every piece of media became another factor in the emotional calculus Harry and Meghan had to consider. Meanwhile, palace aides were scrambling. Some were loyal to William, working to reinforce the narrative of justified protocol and tradition. Others sympathized with Harry and Meghan, quietly questioning the decision and offering discreet support. The internal environment became a web of competing loyalties, whispered conversations, and subtle maneuvering, as everyone tried to anticipate what the next viral story would bring.